Greetings to my dear guests on this video. I wish you a pleasant viewing and look forward to your feedback in the comments. Margaret smoothed the creases of her skirt before slipping into the staff lounge, carrying a small stack of employee handbooks that needed updating. The place, usually alive with casual chatter, was unusually subdued. Conversations halted when she entered, replaced by uncomfortable glances and murmured greetings. She pretended not to notice. After nearly 3 decades in this building, she had learned that sometimes it was kinder to let people keep their secrets. Still, the tension lingered like smoke. She placed the handbooks neatly on the counter and moved toward the coffee machine. That's when she overheard 2 junior employees speaking in hushed, urgent tones just around the corner. "I heard he's cutting 5 more by the end of the month," one whispered. "Yeah," the other replied. "But it's not about saving money. Word is, Nathan's trying to make room for her." Margaret froze, her hand hovering above the coffee pot. "Who?" the first voice asked, eager. "You know, that woman from his last job, marketing department. Supposed to be brilliant, but—" The voice dropped even lower. "They're involved." A short, nervous laugh followed. "Must be nice. 1 minute you're struggling to hit your targets, next you're promised a corner office. At someone else's expense." Their footsteps moved away before Margaret could hear more. She stood there for a long moment, her tea forgotten. Nathan Brooks had arrived 6 months earlier, bringing sweeping changes under the banner of modernization. He was everything the board had wanted: young, ambitious, polished. But Margaret had seen the small cruelties, the favoritism disguised as talent recognition, the quiet disappearances of older staff members who had built the company's reputation while Nathan polished its image. She had thought herself safe, so close to retirement. She had believed, naively she now realized, that decades of loyalty still meant something. Walking slowly back to her office, Margaret stared at the framed photographs lining the hallway. Award ceremonies, holiday parties, team-building weekends long gone. She was in many of them, always smiling, always present. She had been part of the company's fabric, but fabric, she now understood, could be torn easily. Later that afternoon, she sat at her desk, pretending to review reports while her mind raced. She recalled seeing Nathan speaking animatedly to a blonde woman a few weeks ago during a so-called networking event. Margaret had thought nothing of it at the time. Now, the memory soured. Could it really be happening? Downsizing to make way for a mistress? Margaret closed her office door quietly and leaned against it, breathing deeply. It was not fear she felt. Not yet. It was anger. A slow, simmering anger that settled deep in her chest. She had given them everything: her youth, her energy, her time. And now she could feel the slow tightening of the noose. Still, Margaret was not one to panic. She would wait, watch, listen, and if necessary, act. Margaret folded her cardigan neatly over the back of her chair, sat down, and opened her daily planner. Her desk was orderly as always, incoming mail in one tray, outgoing documents in another. Even in the final days of her career, she approached each task with the same discipline that had defined her decades of service. The company had changed in many ways, but Margaret hadn't. Her sense of duty wasn't something that could be erased by time, or by the arrival of a new face in an expensive suit. Nathan Brooks had a peculiar way of walking through the office, always fast, never stopping unless he wanted something. His smiles were thin, calculated. He called everyone by their first names, even those old enough to be his parents, and spoke in sleek, corporate buzzwords that sounded like they were pulled from a PowerPoint presentation rather than formed in genuine thought. Margaret hadn't had many direct dealings with him. He'd shaken her hand at the holiday party, called her a pillar of the team, and then promptly ignored her ever since. That suited her fine. She had never needed praise. Her work spoke for itself. Still, the tone around the office was shifting. People were whispering more. Doors were being closed that once remained open. Files disappeared from shared drives without notice. And just yesterday, one of the receptionists, an older woman who had worked at the front desk for nearly as long as Margaret, had been let go with no explanation. Just a polite meeting and a cardboard box. Margaret told herself not to worry. She was too close to retirement for any of this to touch her. What would be the point? She had even picked out the dress she would wear for her farewell lunch on Friday. Her daughter, Susan, was coming in from Seattle. There would be cake. Balloons, perhaps. A few polite speeches. She reached into her drawer and took out a manila folder containing her final performance reports, something she had taken great care preparing for her successor. Just as she flipped it open, there was a firm knock on her door. She turned, expecting a colleague. Instead, Nathan Brooks stood in the doorway, hands in his pockets. "Margaret," he said smoothly, "have a minute?" She gestured to the chair across from her, suppressing the small wave of discomfort rising in her chest. He didn't sit. "There's something we need to discuss," he continued, his voice even, too even. "We've had to initiate urgent staff cuts, budgetary restructuring. I know it's sudden, but it's affecting multiple departments." Margaret frowned. "I see. Do you need my help transitioning someone out?" Nathan paused, and for a fraction of a second, his eyes flicked toward her desk drawer, the one where she kept her retirement papers. "Possibly," he said, "but let's meet tomorrow. I'll have the details ready then." And just like that, he turned and left. Margaret remained frozen in her chair, hands still on the folder. Her heart had started to thump, not loudly, but insistently, like a warning drum. She closed the folder slowly and stared at her desktop. Something about his tone, his choice of words, the way he hadn't sat down, gnawed at her. Urgent staff cuts, a meeting scheduled for the next day. Why involve her at all, with 2 working days left? She glanced out the window toward the parking lot, where Nathan's car, the new black BMW, gleamed in the afternoon sun. Suddenly, her retirement didn't feel quite so certain. Margaret didn't sleep well that night. She tried. She had her usual chamomile tea, laid her robe over the armchair, even read a few pages of a novel before bed. But the words swam on the page, and her mind circled endlessly around the same question. Why meet with her, 2 days before retirement? By morning, she was exhausted. Still, she rose early, as she always had, dressed in her neatest cream blouse, pinned her hair up, and left home 20 minutes ahead of schedule. She needed the quiet of the early office, needed space to think. Her inbox was full, mostly final confirmations for her farewell lunch. She smiled faintly at a message from Linda in HR. "Looking forward to celebrating you this Friday. Your legacy means a lot to us." Legacy. The word settled in her chest like a stone. At 9 a.m. sharp, Nathan walked in, unannounced. "Let's talk," he said, holding a slim folder. He didn't wait for her to invite him in this time. She gestured stiffly, and he took the seat across from her. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed. "I'll get straight to it," he said, sliding the folder across her desk. "Due to urgent budgetary concerns and restructuring, your position is being dissolved, effective immediately." Margaret blinked. She stared at him, then at the folder. "I'm retiring in 2 days." He nodded, the same polite smile never leaving his face. "Yes, I know. But legally, you're still employed. Your name was included in the latest round of redundancies. It was finalized this morning." She opened the folder with numb fingers. It was a severance agreement, the kind she'd prepared for others over the years. Simple, cold, final. "If you sign by tomorrow noon," Nathan said smoothly, "you'll receive your severance and retirement payout as outlined." "And if I don't?" His smile widened. "Then, unfortunately, due to the nature of this termination, you'll forfeit both." Margaret's throat tightened. "You're telling me that if I don't sign this, I lose the pension I earned for nearly 3 decades. He didn't flinch. "The pension is tied to the retirement arrangement, which has now been nullified by the redundancy." It was so clean, so rehearsed, that she felt sick. She tried to find the words, but her voice trembled. "Why me?" Nathan stood. "We had to make difficult decisions. This wasn't personal." But it was. She saw it in his eyes. The dismissive flicker, the cool confidence of someone who had already moved on, someone who assumed she would quietly accept it and disappear. He left without another word. Margaret sat frozen. She reread the agreement 3 times, but it didn't change. She thought of the photos in her hallway, the nights she stayed late, the weekends missed, the letters of thanks from grateful clients, all meaningless now. Her hand hovered over the phone. Instead of calling her daughter or HR, she scrolled to a number she hadn't dialed in over a decade. She stared at it. Then, without hesitating, she pressed call. It rang twice. A calm, steady voice answered. Daniel Morton. She closed her eyes. Daniel, it's Margaret Allen. There was a brief silence on the other end. Then, well, I didn't expect to hear your voice again. I need to talk to you. It's urgent. Daniel's tone changed immediately. Where and when? Margaret's voice was quiet but certain. Tonight, my place. I'll make tea. The kettle had just begun to whistle when Margaret opened the front door. Daniel stood on the porch in a dark overcoat, just as he used to wear, though his hair was grayer now, and the edges of his face carried time more visibly. Still, there was something unchanged about him, a quiet solidity, a steadiness that Margaret had almost forgotten existed in people. Still make Earl Grey? He asked, with a small, familiar smile. She nodded and stepped aside to let him in. They didn't speak much until they were seated at the kitchen table, each with a cup of tea between their hands. The silence was not uncomfortable. It was the kind that came from history. Margaret studied his face, still sharp, still thoughtful. I didn't know who else to call. Daniel didn't ask why. He waited. She opened the folder and slid the severance agreement toward him. His eyes scanned it silently. I was supposed to retire in 2 days, she said quietly. But he nullified the agreement. He said if I don't sign that by noon tomorrow, I walk away with nothing. Daniel leaned back in the chair, frowning slightly. That's not just unethical, it's malicious. I've been trying to convince myself it's just policy, she said. But I've worked in HR long enough to know the signs. He wants me out, fast, quietly. Daniel tapped the edge of the contract. This was written by someone who knows how to close doors behind people. She looked at him. Can he get away with it? There was a pause. Depends on how well he's covered. This kind of document, so close to retirement, it would never pass an internal audit if anyone cared to ask the right questions. But who would? He's the CEO now, and if the board backs him, he's untouchable. Margaret felt her stomach turn. I think he's protecting someone. Daniel raised an eyebrow. There's talk in the office. A woman from his former company, young, attractive, no qualifications that would justify replacing experienced staff. Daniel nodded slowly. So he's cleaning house before she arrives. She swallowed hard. He smiled, Daniel, when he handed it to me, as if it were nothing. Because to him it is. Margaret's voice was tight now. I kept thinking, if I was just a few days closer to the end, I would have escaped it. But he knew exactly when to strike. He waited. Daniel was quiet a moment, then said, You're not the first he's done this to, are you? She shook her head. No, a woman in reception, another in accounting, both over 50. He exhaled slowly. It's a pattern. Margaret's hands trembled. She folded them in her lap. I don't have the strength to fight a man like him, she said. He has people, lawyers. The board likes him. But you have me, Daniel said quietly. She looked up at him, startled. Do you remember why we stopped speaking? He continued, not harshly. You said I always took things too far, that I made enemies when I didn't need to. She remembered. And yes, Daniel had always had a way of finding the cracks and pulling at them, sometimes with little care for consequences. But sometimes, Margaret, he added, the only way to stop a man like Nathan is to become someone he doesn't expect. She stared at him, unsure if she was afraid or relieved. Daniel picked up the folder again. Don't sign this. But He held up a hand. Not yet. Let me look into him, quietly. See what he's hiding. If he wants a war, we'll give him one. But on your terms. Margaret hesitated. Then, finally, nodded. For the first time that day, she felt the smallest breath of air return to her lungs. Margaret barely slept again that night, but it was a different kind of wakefulness. No longer heavy with helplessness, but sharp, calculating. By sunrise, she was sitting at the kitchen table with a notepad, writing down everything she could remember about the past few months. Every strange meeting, every abrupt resignation, every uneasy conversation she had overheard but dismissed at the time. Daniel arrived at 8 with a travel mug of black coffee and a thick manila envelope. I pulled some threads, he said, sliding into the chair across from her. Nathan Brooks left his last company under questionable circumstances. Officially, it was called a strategic departure. Unofficially, it was a nudge out the door after several complaints were filed. Margaret leaned in. What kind of complaints? Daniel opened the envelope and spread out a few printed pages. Abuse of authority, nepotism, personal relationships with subordinates. Margaret's heart sank. It was worse than she thought. It's not public record, Daniel said. They paid settlements and forced NDAs, but a few whispers slipped through industry networks. Margaret tapped her fingers against her teacup. So this isn't the first time he's destroyed people's careers for personal gain. Not even close. They sat for a moment in silence, the magnitude of it weighing down the air between them. Daniel, Margaret said finally, voice steady. If I'm going to fight him, I can't just accuse him without proof. He smiled faintly. Already ahead of you. He produced a small digital recorder and a notebook. You're going to stay calm. Go to work like nothing happened. Go to the meeting he set up. If he says anything, outside the legal script, record it. You won't confront him. You won't argue. Just listen. Let him dig his own grave. Margaret swallowed hard. And if he doesn't say anything? Then we find another way. He leaned forward. You're a model employee, Margaret. 30 years of spotless records, awards, client testimonies. If this goes to court, he'll have to justify why you were the one chosen for redundancy 2 days before retirement. Margaret nodded slowly. And the mistress? Daniel's eyes darkened. Already looking into it. If she's hired illegally, without qualifications, or if she benefits financially from this, that's corruption. Even the board won't protect him if it becomes public. Margaret exhaled, a tremor leaving her body. I'll go in, she said. I'll do everything like normal, but I'm not signing anything, not until we have enough. Daniel smiled, not kindly, but with the quiet approval of someone seeing an old friend find their strength again. One more thing, he added, pulling out a disposable cell phone. Use this for anything related to him, not your personal line. Assume your office phone and email aren't safe anymore. Margaret hesitated only a moment before taking it. Later that day, she returned to the office as if nothing had changed. The receptionist offered a stiff smile. There was an odd energy in the air, as though everyone knew something but dared not speak. Margaret sat at her desk, opened her planner, and pretended to be reviewing final notes. Her real focus, though, was sharpened to a razor's edge. Nathan passed her office once, glancing in casually, but she caught the flicker of annoyance in his eyes when he saw her still there. Good, she thought. Let him wonder. As she organized files, she slipped the recorder into her blazer pocket. Ready. The meeting tomorrow would be different. This time, she would not walk in blind. She would walk in prepared, and Nathan Brooks would never see it coming. The next morning, Margaret dressed with unusual care. A simple navy suit, low heels, her hair pinned neatly. She looked every inch the professional Nathan had underestimated. At 9 a.m. sharp, she walked into the meeting room Nathan had indicated. It was a small, glass-walled conference room near his office. Too small for comfort, designed to intimidate. Nathan was already inside, lounging in one of the sleek chairs, scrolling casually on his phone. He didn't bother standing when she entered. "Margaret, he said, with a bright, hollow smile. Thanks for being prompt. She took a seat across from him, her heart pounding so hard she feared he might hear it. The recorder, tucked carefully inside her jacket, was already running. Nathan pushed a fresh copy of the severance agreement across the table. I wanted to give you another opportunity to review this, he said, voice syrupy. We believe it's a generous offer, considering the circumstances. Margaret kept her face neutral. Circumstances? Nathan shrugged. Budget cuts. Department reorganization. You know how it is. He smiled again, that same condescending smile that made Margaret's blood run cold. Of course, he added casually, if you choose not to accept, the company would have no choice but to proceed without any payout. Margaret said nothing. She simply nodded, as if considering. Nathan leaned forward, lowering his voice conspiratorially. Between us, I'd hate to see you lose everything after so many years. That would be unfortunate. Margaret fought the urge to clench her fists. He wasn't threatening her outright. No, he was careful. Polished. A man who had done this before. But on tape, it didn't matter. His words, his tone, it would be enough to suggest coercion. She folded the papers neatly and placed them in her bag. I'll review everything carefully. Good, Nathan said, already dismissing her with his posture. But remember, deadline's noon tomorrow. She stood. I'll keep that in mind. And she left, walking calmly through the corridor, though her knees trembled. In her office, she shut the door and immediately texted Daniel using the burner phone. Got it. He replied within seconds. Good. Move to step 2. Step 2 was riskier. Margaret pulled up the internal HR system on her computer. As a senior manager, she still had access to certain administrative files, at least for now. She searched for recent employment records. Sure enough, under a newly created marketing division, there was a name she recognized. Victoria Hayes. No photo, no detailed CV uploaded. Just a bare-bones record. Started employment 2 weeks ago. Position: Senior Marketing Advisor. Margaret's mouth tightened. 2 weeks ago, around the same time the first layoffs began. Her hands moved swiftly. She downloaded a copy of Victoria's employment record and saved it to a secure drive Daniel had given her. Evidence. But the clock was ticking. If Margaret didn't submit her retirement papers, correctly filed and approved, within the next 48 hours, she could lose her eligibility for her pension permanently. Nathan knew that. That's why he had set the severance deadline for tomorrow. He was boxing her into a corner where fear would do the work for him. Margaret stared at the pension packet sitting unopened on her desk. All the years she had dreamed about this moment. The relief, the pride, the small ceremony with her children there. And now it had been turned into a weapon. She glanced at the recorder still humming quietly in her pocket. No, she wouldn't be bullied into submission. Not yet. That afternoon, Daniel met her in a quiet park several blocks from the office. She handed him the drive and the recorder. Daniel's face darkened as he reviewed what she had collected. It's enough to rattle him, maybe even enough to open an inquiry if we push at the right spot. Margaret exhaled slowly. But it's not enough to stop him. Not yet, Daniel agreed. But we have a window. He thinks you're scared. He thinks you'll fold by noon tomorrow. He looked at her carefully. Are you ready to do what needs to be done before then? Margaret hesitated, not from fear, but from the deep, exhausted sadness of someone who realizes they can never return to who they were before. Then she straightened. I'm ready. Margaret spent that night preparing, methodically and quietly. At 6:30 a.m., she parked not at the office, but 2 blocks away. She carried a simple manila folder, light enough to avoid suspicion, but heavy enough to make her hands sweat. Inside were copies of everything. The recording of Nathan coercing her into signing under duress. The employment record of Victoria Hayes, showing suspicious hiring practices. Her full personnel file, awards, commendations, spotless reviews. Proof of what she was, and proof of what Nathan was trying to erase. She wasn't going to confront Nathan directly. Not yet. No, that would be foolish. He held too much sway over the board, too many polished lies to throw like a net. She needed another way. She needed pressure. Margaret stepped into the company's marble lobby just before 7 a.m., when the building was nearly empty. Only the security guard, a kind-faced man named Tom, sat behind the desk. "Morning, Miss Allen," he said warmly. "Working early today?" Margaret smiled tightly. "Just tying up some loose ends." Tom buzzed her through without a second glance. Once inside, Margaret made her way to the executive floor. She moved carefully, listening for footsteps. The offices were mostly dark. She found the assistant's mail drop, a slot built into the HR director's door, and slid the sealed envelope through. It landed with a quiet thud inside. Step 1 complete. The HR director, Mr. Klein, was no fool. Margaret trusted him to recognize the seriousness of what he'd find when he opened the envelope. She still had one more move to make. At 7:45 a.m., she logged into her work email. Daniel had created a timed message for her, a clean, anonymous tip set to send itself to several board members and one external compliance officer if Margaret didn't cancel it by noon. A simple subject line: urgent, ethical violations, immediate review recommended. Margaret's heart pounded as she activated the final step. Now, unless she personally stopped the send-off before noon, the system would automatically alert the people Nathan most feared. Her hands shook slightly as she closed the laptop. All she had to do now was wait, and hope the timing was right. At 8:30 a.m., the office buzzed into life. Phones rang, heels clicked down corridors. Margaret sat at her desk, working through meaningless tasks, pretending her world hadn't been turned upside down. At 9:15 a.m., Nathan strode past her office with that same fake grin, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit, looking every bit the young titan. Margaret's stomach twisted, but she forced herself to smile politely as he waved in passing. He didn't know yet, but he would. At 10 a.m., Daniel texted, "Call me the moment anything happens. Watch carefully. They might panic fast." By 10:30 a.m., Margaret saw the first sign: two members of the HR team hurrying down the hall, speaking in low, urgent voices. At 11 a.m., a stern-looking board member, Mr. Halston, arrived unannounced. Margaret hadn't seen Halston in person for months. He wasn't the type to waste time on office visits unless something was seriously wrong. She pretended to be immersed in spreadsheets as Halston passed. At 11:15 a.m., Nathan's door slammed shut, loud enough for people down the hall to look up. Margaret kept her face neutral. Her fingers hovered over her burner phone, tempted to text Daniel immediately. But no, not yet. At 11:30 a.m., the HR director, Mr. Klein himself, walked into Nathan's office without knocking, holding a familiar manila envelope. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. The clock ticked. At 11:45 a.m., Nathan reappeared, his face tight, his jaw clenched. He didn't look at Margaret as he passed her office. He went straight for the executive elevators. Margaret sat back in her chair, hands trembling slightly, and closed her eyes. She didn't know exactly what was being said behind closed doors. She didn't know exactly what decisions were being made. But she knew one thing. Nathan Brooks wasn't smiling anymore, and noon was still 15 minutes away. At 11:55 a.m., Margaret sat perfectly still at her desk, her hand hovering over her burner phone. The automatic email exposing Nathan's misconduct would send at exactly noon unless she canceled it. She watched the second hand crawl forward on the clock across the room. Then, just as the hand touched 11:56, her office phone rang. She picked it up carefully. "Miss Allen," came the clipped voice of Mr. Klein, the HR director. "The board requests your presence in the large conference room immediately." Her mouth was dry, but her voice was steady. "I'm on my way." Margaret rose, smoothed her skirt, and took a deep breath. The entire floor felt different now. Brittle, electric. Whispers passed between desks, heads turned subtly in her direction. The large conference room, usually reserved for quarterly meetings, now held in uncomfortable gravity. Inside, 6 people sat at the long glass table. Mr. Halston, 2 other board members, Mr. Klein from HR, a corporate attorney she didn't recognize, and Nathan Brooks. Nathan didn't meet her eyes as she entered. Margaret sat down calmly at the opposite end of the table. She rested her hands lightly on the folder she carried, her retirement paperwork, untouched, but still ready. "Miss Allen," Halston began formally, "thank you for joining us on such short notice. We are aware that you were recently presented with a severance agreement. We have now reviewed certain concerning documents submitted this morning." He glanced meaningfully at Nathan. Nathan shifted in his seat, a muscle twitching along his jaw. "We would like to offer you the opportunity to clarify. Were you coerced or otherwise pressured into signing a severance under threat of losing your earned retirement benefits?" Margaret met Halston's eyes directly. "Yes," she said simply. There was a murmur down the table. Nathan opened his mouth as if to interrupt, but Halston raised a hand sharply. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "you will remain silent until addressed." Nathan's face darkened, but he complied. Margaret continued, her voice clear, deliberate. "I was 2 days away from retiring with full benefits. Mr. Brooks informed me that unless I signed the severance immediately, I would lose everything I had earned. He presented it under the false justification of urgent downsizing, despite my imminent retirement. Furthermore, there were irregularities in recent hiring practices that suggest personal motivations rather than business necessity." She slid a copy of Victoria Hayes's suspicious hiring file across the table. The attorney picked it up, his brow furrowing deeply. Silence hung thick in the room. Halston spoke again, voice steely. "We are launching a full independent investigation into Mr. Brooks's management practices, effective immediately. His access to company systems has been suspended as of this morning." Margaret's heart leapt, but she kept her face neutral. Halston continued, turning toward her fully. "As for you, Miss Allen, your retirement status has been reinstated in full. Your pension and benefits package will proceed exactly as outlined in your original agreement. I would personally like to apologize for the undue distress caused." For a moment, Margaret couldn't speak. The relief washed over her so powerfully, she had to tighten her grip on the folder to steady herself. "Thank you," she said at last, voice thick with restrained emotion. "That's all I ever asked for." Halston gave a sharp nod. "You are dismissed, Miss Allen. Thank you for your patience and your dignity." Margaret stood. As she left, she allowed herself a glance at Nathan. The bright, polished smile was gone. What was left was something uglier: bitterness, humiliation, fear, and Margaret felt no pity at all. In the hallway, she paused by the window, breathing in the cool, crisp air that streamed through the slight crack. She pulled out her burner phone and sent one simple text to Daniel. "It's done." A moment later, he replied, "Proud of you." Margaret smiled, a real, genuine smile this time, and walked calmly back to her office. There, she opened her retirement packet, signed it with a steady hand, and submitted it officially. 30 minutes later, her retirement was locked in and irreversible. For the first time in days, Margaret allowed herself to breathe fully, long, deep, and free. She had not been erased. She had not been broken. She had taken back what was hers, not through rage, not through revenge, but through quiet, relentless strength. And as she gathered her few remaining things and turned off the lights in her office for the last time, Margaret knew she wasn't leaving defeated. She was leaving victorious.